Good morning, friends. This is Ani Agnihotri from Atlanta, USA. I am co-founder of USA India Business Summit, and it is our honor to present India-China Border Standoff webinar, an Indian perspective of different scenarios and their business implications in partnership with Georgia Tech Cyber. My partner and co-chair of Georgia Tech's Business Forum, Dr. John McIntyre, is with us. And our third presenting partner is ACIR, along with the USIBRC and China Research Center and Georgia Tech CIST. We welcome you all for this special program. It is my honor to introduce our speakers of the day today, Mr. Pradeep Bajal, retired IAS officer who was a former Secretary of Ministry of Disinvestment for Government of India and is also a very renowned and known author. Mr. Bajal is formally trained in reforms, privatization and growth issues in Oxford, Harvard and Tokyo, and headed most reform liberalization departments like industrial development in a state, private power, disinvestment, telecom, broadcasting, etc. His books, articles, and presentations on privatization, telecom reforms in India are on Amazon, Google, and YouTube, etc. His books are Disinvestment in India, I Lose and You Gain, published by Pearson in 2008. A Bureaucrat Fights Back, The Complete Story of Indian Reforms, published by HarperCollins in 2016. And lastly, Containing the China Onslaught, The Role of US, Japan, India, and Other Democracies, published by Quadrant India in 2020, this year. Mr. Bajal is joining us from Delhi, India. Good morning, Mr. Bajal. Welcome. Now, our second speaker of the day is Dr. Anupam Srivastava. Anupam is a dear friend for many years. He has varied experience spanning about 25 years working at the intersection of advanced technology, commerce, and international security. He currently serves as a non-resident fellow at the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., with a focus on providing legal regulatory assistance to government agencies and their high-tech industrial sectors. His work draws upon his prior stint at the University of Georgia, where as assistant director at the Center for International Trade and Security, he directed and worked on multiple projects supported by the US Department of State and Energy, UN, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. In addition, he serves as Vice President, International Strategy and Business Development of Safe Zone Limited, which provides software-based technical support for classification of dual-use and munitions items customized for use by licensing and enforcement agencies in government and by compliance units within corporations globally. Dr. Srivastava previously served as Managing Director of Invest India, the official investment facilitation agency of Government of India, and concurrently served as Assistant Secretary General at FICCI. The Invest India team helped expedite regulatory approvals and facilitated implementations of multiple investment projects into India, totaling about over 2 billion. Our moderator of the day is Dr. Penny Prime. Again, Dr. Penny and I have been also friends for many, many years. She is founding director of China Research Center in Atlanta and also managing editor for China Currents. Her expertise is in Chinese economy and business environment. Beginning with her first visit to China in 1976, Dr. Prime has more than 4 decades of experience studying the dynamic Chinese economy. After majoring in Chinese studies and studying Mandarin as an undergraduate, she earned a PhD in economics at the University of Michigan. She was one of the first US graduate students to visit China for dissertation research after the US and China normalized relations. Dr. Prime is the founding director of China Research Center and managing editor of China Currents. She was clinical professor at the Institute of International Business at J. Mac Robinson College of Business, Georgia State University from 2012 to 2020. Professor at Mercer University 2006 to 2012, earning tenure, and professor at Kennesaw State University from 1991 to 2006, earning tenure. Between 1987 and 2009, She co-developed and led 11-week student-focused seminars with Carleton College of Asia and China. She has also taught at Emory University and Duke University as a visiting professor. Welcome, Dr. Penny Bryan.
Yeah.
With this, I would like to hand it over to you, Penny, and I'm ready with the speaker presentations as and when you would ask me to.
Okay. Well, our first speaker is going to be Mr. Baijal, and I think he's prepared his remarks. So let's begin with him.
Okay. 1 second, please.
Let me start with my book.
Okay.
I decided to write a book on China. There are various reasons that I decided to write in China. And I started this book in 2015. Since 2015, there's never been a dull day. First of all, when I started the book, it was US plus China. US wanting China to take over the world. The reasons were very strange. Everyone knows. I wouldn't like to go into them. They were trying to settle Soviet Russia, perhaps. But then, by the time they went into this partnership, the Eastern Bloc, the East Europe, and Russia had already collapsed. But they continued their partnership with China. When this happened, I also had to change the book. I named it Containing the China Onslaught. Now it was role of US, Japan, and India in containing China. US, Japan, India, and other democracies in containing China. In the 2020 elections, somehow the main issue was allowed to become governance and hence Corona. China issue going into the background. Consequently, Trump lost the election. China also completed the 5th plenum last month. Joe Biden also won the elections last week. So lots of things have happened in this period. In 2015, Trump suddenly announced that he would fix China. When he announced this, he caught the people's attention and he won the election. And exactly the opposite happened in 2020. And now, the border issues that I've been asked to speak on have become business issues, as they always were, and I'll explain. China has always been expansionist. The populace almost worshipping Mao and earlier the Qing dynasty, who acquired enormous area. Xi is trying to do the same with Taiwan, areas in North India, China Sea, etc., leading to international opposition. But he has become a hero in China. Perhaps that is the reason that since he is going with the expansionist policies of China always, therefore, he is continuing with this policy and he believes that he can overtake the world. At present, he is happy because now the new president has come in and he's also coming in very slowly, at a very slow speed he's coming in. And he thinks that by the time he settles down, he will complete a lot of his policies. But before I go into that, I would like you to see the next slide, where I have shown that if China continues to grow at the rate that China was growing in the past, then very soon, by about 2070, China will own half the world. 18% of the world would be owned by, in terms of GDP, will be owned by a fascist nation. The fascist nation owning 18% of the population, owning 50% of the GDP, will be a very dangerous consequence for the world, and I don't know where the world would then go. So we need to look at strategies to check China. Why did why did China get into the expansionist framework? If you see the slide of 1892, the red slide, then after the Qing's dynasty, China was huge. China was a very large country. After 1892, Qing's dynasty, then gradually came the nationalist government. They were weak, and China was reduced to a minimum. Today, the China is the blue map, which is less. There's no Mongolia there. Though I've added Tibet here, and though I've added the Indian territory, which was acquired at Chin in 1962. And China is smaller than the King's China. And the expansionist nation looks at China with the perception of the red map. And that's why it continues to be an expansionist, because both the Qing and Mao are the heroes even today in China. And Xi and all the Chinese are very concerned also about the century of humiliation. Century of humiliation was 1839 to 1949, a period of 100 years, when China lost control over large portions of its territory. And that is the modern narrative that Xi is looking at, that he must regain those areas. And that is why he continues to have the expansionist policy, and the entire world is very concerned. He's not only trying to acquire areas, he started this scheme BRI. And what is BRI leading to? BRI is leading to China going to all the countries through the new road, through the new links, because he wants to either acquire the area or have a connection to the new markets that he has created. When the Chinese started with the US support, Chinese were, say, 100. Today, they are 500 to 700. You look at the next slide. Today, and I've only compared with India, because India has a big problem with China. It's China's neighbor, it has a big size. And till about a few years back, till about 1995, China and India had the same GDP, had the same population, and most importantly, from 1 AD to 1995 AD, they had the same GDP. Till about 1830, they had a rising GDP. But they had a similar GDP. After 1830, when lots of changes started happening, I'll deal with those changes. But the first change that happened was that after the American cooperation, they started acquiring markets. And how did they acquire these markets? They acquired these markets, number one, because America started helping China in a very big way. It thought that that will lead to crumbling of Soviet Russia. But I've already said that Soviet Union had already crumbled. So why did this policy continue? This policy continued because Deng became the president, and he was a very wise man. And he used the art of deception. He used 36 stratagems to make a fool of the United States, according to me. How did he make a fool of the United States? He made a fool of the United States by making it believe that growing China was a positive step. Secondly, the corporates in China were also growing. When the corporates, when China, when US started helping China and took China almost in the US bloc and also was assured of the market, Deng was a very wise man. He never gave the markets. He only allowed the American companies to locate themselves in China, and they gave markets mainly to those companies, with the result that United States collapsed. United States collapsed by way of lost employment. And that lost employment was encashed by Trump when he won the election. The second disturbing thing which happened was that in 1998, China applied for WTO membership. Russia also applied for WTO membership. Russia had become democratic earlier. They also applied for the membership of WTO, but they got membership in 2012. Most other countries in that period got membership after 2001. Everyone knows that China was not a very ideal candidate for membership of WTO because there was intense technology theft from China, and they were breaking all the rules of the game. And what was the impact? You look at the map on the blue map, that is the Chinese market, or that is the Chinese influence areas. And after they joined the WTO, they suddenly expanded their market. There was no cooperation. 1 billion workers joined the WTO suddenly. And look at the map on the right. The entire world was swept off by China at the expense of US. China usurped the US and took away US markets and got all those markets itself, and therefore they had a huge growth. Now, during this period, there were many instances when India and China had a border dispute, and they kept having border disputes. People think that these border disputes were natural. They were not. These border disputes are basically a function of trying to acquire more power. They are power issues, they're not border issues. And why I say that is that China kept acquiring areas in South China Sea. They wanted to approach the Indian Ocean. They wanted to approach Bay of Bengal. Indian Ocean, they approached by constructing a road in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, in Pakistan-occupied India. And that road is unpopular even in Pakistan, but they have constructed that road. Towards the Bay of Bengal, they have a road basically through Myanmar, where they bought an oil field, they're developing an oil field. And in South China Sea, they wanted control over Gulf of Malacca because most of the trade between east to west goes through Gulf of Malacca. And they wanted also to settle Japan by getting some islands in the Pacific, and that they started doing. But this story, this beautiful story for China, was broken in 2020. This beautiful story was broken by the Ladakh incident. It's really a watershed. This was the first time when the Indian government checked, only this year, when the Indian government checked the Chinese government in Ladakh. And India in 2020 was no longer a weak country, which allowed other countries to do anything with its territory. And I think that is the watershed moment in history. But India will not be able to fight China. Today, China is, unlike in the past, China is much bigger, much powerful. It has a huge military expense and has a huge power. India will not be able to check China. So unless the entire world realizes, unless United States realizes who were responsible for taking China to this level, that it even became a competitor to USA, and there are indications that it will not only remain a competitor, it will become much bigger than United States. So the leadership of the world will go to a fascist nation. Prime Minister Modi has acquired an image of a strong man. China wants to destroy that image because they don't want the world to go with Modi. And they're trying to do that in Ladakh and in various other places. So we need total cooperation between India and USA. Like USA had collaborated with China and made them so great. And the world's interest in India is that India is a democracy. Please remember, this was the issue in 1971 also. There are indications in my book that China, that USA in 1960s and in late 1960s was considering whether it should partner India or whether it should partner China. At that time, in 1950s, China had tried to grow, and China started Red Guards, China started the next leap forward, and there was total chaos. At this time, visionary Mao decided that we can only grow if we go to the country with the highest GDP, United States. Only they can teach us how to grow. And that is our 100 years marathon. When they went into this marathon, first, USA said, we are not joining you. This is a very dangerous country. We will not join China. So Mao waited for a couple of years. Mao did nothing for a couple of years. Then came 1971. And I'll tell you the connection between 1971 and the Chinese supremacy later. In 1971, Indira Gandhi won the Bangladesh war, almost at the expense of the United States, because the United States was supporting Pakistan all the time. And they even decided to send the 7th Fleet. At this time, Mrs. Gandhi got the Russians to send their ships near Bangladesh, and that is how Bangladesh was quickly taken over. From this day, Nixon became very allergic to Indira Gandhi, and our friend Mao and Chow, they recognized this. So second round, the first round was in the 60s, after they became independent China. The first round of trying to influence US was in the 50s and 60s. But the second round came after 1971, and it is most important to understand that the second round of getting US in its bloc came after 1971, because Mao and Chow fully recognized that at this time, US will partner us. And US will partner us for reasons of a small ego, not for anything else, because Indira Gandhi had fixed everyone in the Bangladesh war. And in 1972, when China approached the United States, they started reacting favorably. Ultimately, Nixon went to Beijing, and he had the meetings. And very early in the meeting, Nixon said, "Oh, Indira Gandhi, she's a bitch." I was not very sure. I had heard about this. But then, when the documents of that meeting in Beijing were declassified a couple of years back, in those documents, this is very clearly written. And it is very clearly written when Nixon mentioned Indira Gandhi as a bitch, Chow started laughing very loudly. Now, in international meetings, these big leaders don't laugh loudly, but he started laughing very loudly. He started laughing very loudly because apparently Chow knew that Mao's tactic has won. And he knew that now China will partner, now US will partner China, and they did. But unanticipated problems came. The Chinese public started opposing the partnership with USA, a capitalist country, and there were agitations. So Mao, like it happened in all countries, decided to sacrifice Deng. And Deng was sent into a jail. And he remained in a jail for a number of years because he said that this mad reformist is trying to partner USA. I was not trying to partner USA. Gradually, the financial position again deteriorated. And soon thereafter, Mao died. When Mao died, you will all recall that China was taken over by the Gang of Four. And China became uncontrollable. China started breaking up. When China started breaking up, one of the most important constituents of their controlling body in China, Army thought, what should we do? And they decided to sack the Gang of Four, and they brought Deng from the jail. Almost he walked from the jail to the president's house, and he became the president. And people had forgotten about the earlier incident of Mao putting Deng to jail. But the Politburo decided at the instance of army officers in the Politburo that this country will break up if a strong man does not take over, and Deng took over. The Gang of Four was dismissed. From the day that Deng came in, he started working on American policies of marketing. He started working on the policies which earlier Soviet Union had also taken up and collapsed. But Deng was a wise man. He went to the Americans and said, "Sir, please allow me to continue the Communist Party, because it is only the Communist Party which will allow me to run the country. And gradually we will get rid of communism." But the country grew with their Politburo system of government, a vertically integrated system right up to the village. They started growing, but they did not democratize. They did not give up their Chinese Communist Party. At this time,
Mr. Baijal, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. I thought you will give me a warning for 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes.
I will not take more than 5 minutes. So then Chinese started growing very fast. When they grew very fast, Deng retired. Deng retired, you would recall there was a 10-year rule at that time in China. It has recently been broken because of this incident. And CIA started to put pressure on China to bring back democracy. So what did they do? they started the agitation. They started the agitation in China, which resulted, and the Chinese government wanted to control this Tiananmen agitation. So they brought in Deng again, but this time as a defense minister, prime minister becoming defense minister, and Deng very quickly suppressed the movement. He sent in tanks. He said 200 people were killed, 30,000 people were killed, and everyone realized this, and 3 of the Chinese battalion revolted. When this happened, they almost put Deng back into jail. And there were some plans I have read that he was to be executed. So Deng was to be executed, who had put China there. And at this time, then Deng died in 1997 and he faded in public memory. And new presidents took over, and then Xi came, and Xi stabilized China on its growth path. But there were big problems, and the big problems were with the other countries. So other countries started opposing. And now, unless India acquires more power to be able to stand against China, the world will not be stable, because 36% of the world's population stays in these two countries. They are next to each other. They were equal for a major part of the history. So we have to make a program. We have to make a plan, like the Chinese had made the 100 years marathon. We have to make a plan in which India can grow. Now, there are a number of industries where India has led the world. There is the milk industry where India has led the world. There is a soybean industry where it has caught up with China. In the milk production industry, because we have an institution, NDDB, it has grown. In soybean, since a scientific institution came in, they grew. Everyone knows that IT sector's growth has been phenomenal.
Mr. Baijal, let's continue that part of the discussion in the questions.
Okay. I'll there's just one page. I'll give hint and stop. Then last, the telecom sector. It was important for me to put this slide, that after we changed our rules of the game in India, the telecom sector started having a growth which was 3 times of China ever. And we have started taking some markets, but those are very limited areas. And we have to prepare a plan that India gets its rightful place in this area. We have enough talent, we have enough people, we have a large population. And today, thanks to COVID, we have a very large trained and unemployed population. And that, to my mind, is an asset, because that can be retrained into productive uses in the industries where we are very strong.
Excellent ideas. Thank you so much. Thank you for your broad macro historical perspective that we can now build on from there. I would just suggest that, how people view China's rise and its challenges are seen quite differently depending on where you're standing. And you gave, a very interesting but fairly strong perspective from India. I do hope that President-elect Biden, and I do think that he will work with India going forward and really try to build that relationship. But we'll have to wait and see on that. So we'll set aside the other points for now and have Anupam. Let's have your presentation, and then we can go from there.
Penny, thank you. My greetings to everybody who's on this webinar, and I'm glad Mr. Baijal provided a historical thread of China's behavior. Because in China, history is very much a marker or a guide to how the public policy is being thought of and debated at the national level and how it's being carried out. An example with Russia would be that although China and Putin and Xi Jinping are fairly close, they've had multiple, right now Putin and Xi Jinping's countries are close, other regimes are close. But in China, when you mention the 1969 border war and other things, they will call it a recent injustice that they will avenge. And so when you look at technology acquisition of MiG-29s, Sukhoi 30s, and others by China from Russia, these are all technology-based licensed co-transfers to China. So China is, in other words, taking technology from Russia when Russia needs those exports and building on that and using it as a fungible platform to build newer generation technologies. And so many of their aerial platforms are derived from there. So this is a clue or a lens into China that it looks at history, it has patience, it looks at long 2-decade, 3-decade type of strategies and positioning, which is very different from the corporate world's next quarter and 1-year type of targets. And that animates China's thinking in many of these things. What I am going to do is be fairly brief, and I'm doing 2-3 things here. One is I'm talking about the scenarios very briefly, and then give you the highlights of the security landscape we are talking about, because that's obviously getting impacted. And then the business side of things. That's how I'm positioning so the 3 scenarios in the shortest portrayal I can do is, the first one is that this current stalemate, which arises from Chinese aggression. One should remember, first of all, that what we call the LAC, the line of actual control, is a border that has not actually been demarcated on the ground very well. This is a British legacy. When they left this region, there are maps from the British era, and India uses one set of maps, China has a slightly different set. And although they have met for 20 years now through standardized institutional talks, there are still differences in perception. So on some areas of the border, there is still several kilometers worth of difference between the perceptions of the two sides. But in any case, the one that is the generally accepted line between them was crossed by the Chinese, not once, but multiple times, and it led to a brief skirmish standoff and a small unarmed conflict where India lost about 20 odd people, and it's believed that China lost an equal or higher number. But since then, there is a stalemate and a series of talks that are going on. So scenario 1 is that stalemate would continue. Both sides are building up and fortifying their reinforcements. They are settling in for the long winter. Snow has already started to fall. There might be those kinds of situations, and we may have a drag out long stalemate. Scenario 2 is that somewhere along this time, either in the next couple of months or after the snow, maybe in April, May, you might have a short duration, very small, but high intensity conflict. And it might be, I mentioned Ladakh versus Arunachal because there is thinking on the Indian side that what happened in Ladakh was a sideshow and a diversionary tactic by China. Their interest is on the Arunachal side or on the Nepal border, where India was recently building a road. India is heavily fortifying its border infrastructure, and China is concerned about that. So that might be another scenario of some limited territory grab by China. There are strategic reasons for it. You might remember last year when they were shelling forward positions near Bhutan. China wants to checkmate India and grab what is called, India's vulnerable point is called the chicken's neck. It's a small piece of land near Bhutan. So there are strategic reasons for China to do that. Scenario 3 is that we will have these substantive talks, they will continue, and they can lead to a phased de-escalation. And then the two sides will continue their talk about demarcation of the line of control, actual control, both on the maps as well as where should the forward troops be. Because in some places, there is a difference of up to 8 kilometers of where the troop line should be. Next slide. So these are the 3 scenarios. I personally believe that scenario Two is possible that there might be actually a small conflict at some point. So the Indian CD, as the Chief of Defense Staff, says that we are in a no war, no peace situation, and we are prepared because we may have to act very swiftly on this one. And China is amassing a lot of armory and troops in Chengdu and in other places that can serve this forward position. All right. Largest landscape. China has been expanding, as Mr. Baijal said, its sphere of influence in different ways across the world: Asia Pacific, Africa, Europe, Central and Latin America. On the economic dimension, you see this in China becoming the largest trading partner for many countries of the world, including Japan, India itself, although that's changing now a little bit, of the United States, of South Korea, of Japan, and so on. So that gives them a sort of trade embedded relationship with different countries. Businesses are being set up by China for supply chain efficiency, but for other reasons in third countries. And especially once the tariff war started, what they've done is they've moved the shipping label or destination from where it's being shipped, from Hong Kong and Macau or from mainland China into third countries, in Caribbean, in other places where they have businesses. So they do not incur the US tariffs and so on. And there are many other things that China does with its trade relationship with the world and in relationship to the Trump administration's tariffs. China is also massively growing on infrastructure in all different ways: physical and digital infrastructure, optic fiber. You look at India, China's 3G, 4G, and now 5G network, and optic fiber platforms, and many other things. The signature one is the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative. It has many dimensions to it. The one growing into Pakistan or through the disputed territory or Indian land into Kashmir is called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And then you have the Silk Route types that are going both by land into Central Asia and Europe and by sea. It's a very expansive program. China also worked, although India is a founding member and a big contributor, but there is an Asian infrastructure bank that was created 4 years ago. China is using that for lending of infrastructure programs and building dependence. Yuan, the renminbi, is also offered as an alternative currency to the United States, to the US dollar. And as BRI, what China does is it, I need to move faster a little bit. It seeks to build massive infrastructure projects in many parts of the world. And then when countries are not able to repay the loan on that, it's happened most recently in Sri Lanka, in Hambantota in the port. And the Sri Lankan government gave a 99-year lease of that port to China. The same thing is likely to happen in Maldives. It's happening in Mombasa, in the port, where China has built a high-speed rail network and other things. It's equally and surprisingly active in Israel through FDI into high-tech startup companies in Israel. China went from almost less than $1 billion of investment into Israeli high-tech to over 16 billion in 4 years' time. Exactly the period when US had tightened China's FDI coming into itself, its own country. And so from the next year onwards, in the last 4 years, you've seen China rapidly shift that investment into Israel. They have also got major contracts in Haifa in the north, building the entire port overlooking Lebanon, and a lot of tunnel boring contracts across the country. So China is very much present in the infrastructure in Israel, which is strange given how strategic and close high-tech partners Israel and India are. Mike Pompeo, Israel and US are. Mike Pompeo is actually with Benjamin Netanyahu today, this morning as we speak, on the West Bank, going to see the Golan Heights. Military, the plan of China is to draw parity with the US forces in all domains by 2027, including in cyber and anti-satellite. They're conducting joint operations and building future warfare scenarios. They're also creating artificial islands and stocking them with ammunition and so on. Okay, another line here just to say that this expansion of China that I'm talking about is rubbing against the traditional spheres of influence in different parts of the world. With India specifically, it's coming against India's role in South Asia especially. Also its energy and relationship in Central Asia, nuclear and other kinds of material that it draws from there. It works with the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and India's own role in the Indian Ocean region, all the way from the Gulf of Malaccas near South China Sea, going west all the way to the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea in Iran, the entire belt through which 80–90% of international oil and other kinds of commerce in this region happens. Most of Asian countries depend on this route. So freedom of navigation of Indian Ocean is vital. To the US also, the Indo-Pacific becomes vital, and China trying to dominate this region is affecting it. So Washington has decided to use elevate India's standing in its own policy in the Pacific Command as a pivot for many of these operations, and to ensure rules-based open architecture and common navigation. Mr. Baijal mentioned Quad, which is India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. The phase 2 Malabar exercises are happening this week in India, in the Bay of Bengal, in the Arabian Sea. Briefly, the US National Defense Authorization that's coming up. In the area of export controls, they are elevating India. It's already very high with SDA 1, but it's now being elevated to the level of NATO, Australia, and New Zealand. And it's leveraging India's standing as a major defense partner to start building major defense platforms together. Next, please, Ami. I'll take a couple of, Penny, do we have what, 7–8 minutes or 6? How much? Anyway,
how about 5?
5. I'll try and crunch. Yeah. Okay. So I'm mentioning some facts, figures on China's growing role in India. As I mentioned, they already have a very large trade in goods with India, and India actually runs a large trade deficit with China, as you can see, 55 billion. Trade in services has always been small with China, but is set to grow. FDI, China was not really an FDI or a investor into India, but that is beginning to change in the last 2014 to 19, about 8 billion. And what changed was that over the last 1 year, April of last year to March of this year, the equity inflows were about 1 billion. And more importantly, when you break it down, those funds were invested into about 1,600 Indian companies. And you see those sectors. And these were low-key, under the radar, under the equity caps. But what exposed it was, one of these cases was about more than 1% of shareholding into one of the large Indian HDFC banks by the People's Bank of China. And that led to a deeper scrutiny. Now, what happens is, as Ani mentioned, I was once the managing director of India's national investment body. So I worked very closely with the government of China and Chinese companies. In India, we have a review process of investments. And with respect to China, the government had already tightened it to a 2-layer. The first would be by the Ministry of Home Affairs on security issues and the antecedents of those companies. And the second layer that's now been added is with the Department of Public Policy, Investment, and Internal Trade. This is part of the Ministry of Commerce. And along with that, India is now beginning to look at what the US does through its CFIUS. CFIUS is the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. So India is creating a similar structure where it's looking at beneficial owners, saying who now owns when money comes into, say, a foreign money from China comes in, even if that, say, it's a $1 million company. The Chinese investment is 300,000, that's 30%. But if that 30% has gone toward owning the core technology of that company, then China is a beneficial owner and even a majority owner of that technology itself, which it can then use to leverage that knowledge back to itself. And so India is setting up and tightening its screening, FDI screening, to find out beneficial owner and so on. And this is happening in Europe. It happened in March. In Australia, the United States, of course, does screening and is tightening it. And this criteria is growing around the world, and especially with respect to Chinese, but generally screening of FDI from all countries. And another line of weakness for India is that China has become a low-cost, high quantity input supplier to India's chemicals, plastics, dyes, and so on. And that's a vulnerability that India has. It needs to grow those things if it wants to do value-added work on those things. If it's dependent on input from China, then it's not really able to control that very much. Next, Honey. So I just have a couple of slides. I'll finish it in 2 minutes, Penny. So on the US-India side, although that's not the focus of our discussion really, but what is happening is that both are concerned, both have strong relationships with China, both have economic and military relationships, but they are concerned with the abrasive style of Chinese behavior. And the US and India, not directly directed at China, but with an eye on China, are developing and deepening their relationships. US FDI in India is growing. India's FDI into the US is growing, as you can see. And they're building what I call a technology embedded partnership. In some cases, R&D, and leading all the way to production. And I'm just mentioning some high high-tech sectors. There are many others. So robotics, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. Some research has started happening by the two sides under both defense, DTTI, and even in some private sector things. Life sciences, of course. Rare earths, this is another story I might mention in the Q&A, but there are 11 rare earths vital to semiconductor and defense sectors. And China has sort of a monopoly over 8 of them. So US, Japan, China are very concerned. US, Japan, and India are very concerned. The US and India are looking to partner on building another 5G network and to design out the role of Huawei in the other PRC components. They're working on defense manufacturing niche productions, including some jointly with Israel. And Lockheed Martin is already in India since 2016, and in partnership with Tata, it's created more than 150,000 jobs, more than 600 million of exports. And they're designing all the wings of F-16. And if India chooses to buy F-21s under the MMRCA contract, then that as well. These are US demands to increase IP protection and to raise manufacturing safety standards. Next, please, the last one. So I just conclude by saying that, and we'll talk about this in Q&A, is that Beijing will use its own peaceful rise doctrine, the Haping-Jueqi, and to expand its influence until what I call return on investment turns negative. This is China's behavior. Keep on expanding until you meet sufficient opposition and your returns of expansion begin to turn negative. It's also incidentally tightened its investment laws to create a new unreliable entities list. It's mirroring some of the US entity list behavior, and wishes to become, or we expect it to become, progressively assertive as it grows in power. And there are some recommendations for India that are here, including US-India shared values and convergence on core interests. So let me just stop here quickly so it allows some time for Penny and then Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Anupam. For the audience, please do send your questions and comments. Thank you, Anupam, for that broad survey, but with some very particular specific examples. I think this notion of China's peaceful rise is important to kind of put out there on the table, that China's development has been very successful by many measures, as Mr. Baijal mentioned and as everyone knows. And under Deng Xiaoping, that development, starting from a very, very poor country in the late 70s and early 80s, Deng took a approach of develop but not rock the boat, if you will, the kind of this peaceful rise of learn what they can from other countries as they develop, and stay under the radar, if you will, of international affairs. And that lasted for many decades. And many analysts would argue it's really only under President Xi that that's changed in a significant way. And but now China is being more assertive. There's no question about it, and being, trying to decide how it's going to fit into the world. with its new success. But of course, from China's point of view, with any country that becomes more important in the world in terms of economics, that they would play a different role, an increasing role in how the world works. And so I think, from everyone else's point of view, there's certain behaviors that China has that we don't like. And so we've been working to try to coordinate with China and change those behaviors if we can. And if not, learn to live with them or counter them in some ways. But from China's point of view, the people, Chinese people are very proud of what China's done, and China should take its rightful place in the world. And hopefully that will be a peaceful place. But China is also responding to how they view the US as being the US trying to contain China. Right, and so the more we end up with the China group and the non-China group, the anti-China group, it seems to me the more dangerous that becomes. So we need to find ways to work together, right, and to communicate and to shape that rise. And India is certainly in a position to play that role. Along with the US and other countries. But I think now in 2020, one of the issues is that China's success has brought it to the technological frontier of many of these really key technologies, like 5G and AI and many others. And it's because China's at that frontier that it makes leaders of countries and business people more cautious and more nervous about what China's role is going to be. And I think that's in part because we don't know China's intentions. And that's a problem from China's point of view, that it'd be better if their intentions were more clear. But I think India has an opportunity to compete, obviously. And so I would just ask both our speakers, in terms of specific technologies, can India compete and where can they lead as a way to compete with China, let's say. Mr. Baijal?
Yes, I didn't. Can you repeat your question?
I'm asking you what sectors in India technologically it can compete with China.
Well, we have competed very effectively with China in IT. As a matter of fact, when their IT industry was just growing, they took Narayan Murthy, they took so many industrialists, IT industrialists from India to China and helped them set up shops there, helped them set up. So we were always ahead. Then I told you, milk, they are ahead. I also told you that soybean, we've been at par. So we have strengths. Lately, minerals and mineral-based industries, metal industries, are also showing a lot of potential. Earlier, India, which has the maximum coal resources in the world, had started importing coal from all over the world because the regulation in India was jumbled up. When the regulation was jumbled up, the international prices of coal shot up. And India was importing coal at that price to the extent that Indonesia had put an export duty on coal. Now that is now correcting itself, and I hope that when it corrects itself, we will also grow very fast in the metal industry, in the mining industry. There is, of course, a lot of scope in rare earths, which I'm sure Dr. Srivastava will deal with. So there are many areas. Then the Indian DNA is basically digital. It has been shown in the IT industry, in the telecom industry. But there is one disturbing feature which I also must point out. All the changes in world GDPs have occurred with industrial revolution. First industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, the West took over. Third industrial revolution, for various reasons that I have written in the book, China and India took over. But now, what is fourth industrial revolution? Fourth industrial revolution is also in wire and wireless. Fifth industrial revolution, it is also in wire and wireless. Now, there are many services on the same wire and wireless where India and China are very strong. And therefore, India and China have places to compete with the world. This was never so earlier. So I started looking at, will the change take place in the sixth industrial revolution? There is no sixth industrial revolution defined yet. But then I saw that sixth industrial revolution has been termed as interplanetary travel. And that you have many companies which have a huge share value today. Now, that is the sixth industrial revolution. India again has its strengths in interplanetary travel and satellites, etc. So it's going to be a very competitive world. And US had absolutely no competitors. Now US for the first time in history has competitors, and it has a very serious competitor. And if US is not able to compete with China, there will be big problems from the US. So I don't see the India-China border dispute as an India-China border dispute. I see that dispute as a world-China dispute.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Anupam, do you have something to add?
Well, briefly, the IT-enabled services is a very large, multi-billion-dollar opportunity, and India is growing in that space very rapidly. And I think this ability on R&D and on non-linear thinking is leading India to high digital platforms, technology, newer technology solutions, sorts of things. So one example is that GE, Intel, for example, do their R&D work in India, and then they serial manufacturing. Once the chips are designed from Bangalore to Shanghai for serial production, because the infrastructure there is more stable, and China works faster on serializing production. Another example would be in high-end manufacturing would be civilian space applications, satellite manufacturing and other kinds of things, smaller size satellites that India will be launching from next year. So high-end electronic and electrical work. Rare earths, as I mentioned, 8 of these 11 China has a dominance on. And it a few years ago, instituted a policy where anybody who wanted to extract these things from China had to perforce form a 50-50 JV with a Chinese company and part with the proprietary technology before you could mine and take it out. This is contrary to WTO and everything else. So the US, Japan, and India have each sued individually and jointly in the International Court of Justice. And I asked a Chinese government officer on that, saying, why are you contesting this? You're going to lose it. He said, of course we will lose it, but it'll take 10 years. And in the meantime, we would have bled you for as much technology as possible and delayed certain critical manufacturing that you're dependent on from here. So this is just an approach of China, which is highly, highly pragmatic, and it leverages these types of conflicts or situations. Or sometimes if it is weak in, say, position A, it will create another front on position B where it is stronger. And once you are negotiating, they will get better firm terms for themselves in position A, point A. So that's the sort of thing that China does very well. But I will just mention that India has a lot of work on catching up to do, by the way. It can do these things, but it needs to build infrastructure across all of these things, and it needs to have suitable supportive policy framework and stable policies on these things. Otherwise, for global scale work, India won't be able to compete and take advantage of things or companies that are moving away from China. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I would just make one comment, which is, although China's done very well by many measures, we can also go down a very long list of the challenges that China has. It's not that China has solved all of these problems for itself, and it is struggling in its own way to move forward as it sees it needs to do. Well, now I'll turn it over to Dr. McIntyre to consolidate the questions from our audience. Thank you.
Thank you all for a very challenging set of presentations. Some quick questions. How much time do we have left, Anis, as moderator?
So, well, we have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Question number one, Obor, Brie, is India in a position to provide a counter strategy regionally to Obor? Who benefits the most from the Brie initiative? How is the Brie initiative perceived in India?
I don't think, sorry. Question for me?
Yes, Dr. Vaital, I mean, or any
Yes.
of the panelists, but you first.
Yeah. Of course, Obor, because of the nature of location of China and India, Obor hits India the most. But India is not in a position to challenge Obor, because with Obor comes a whole lot of financial aid, which India is not in a position to give. And therefore, the entire India-China dispute will have to be seen as a world-China dispute. And India will not be able to place funds in Obor.
I'll quickly add to John. India, it is not in India's interest, nor is it government's current thinking to actually counter BRI. But what it does is India has upped the game in terms of developmental assistance to countries. So used to be a much smaller amount of government loans, but now through Exim Bank of India and other features, it's very common for India to be offering 5 to 10 million, even $20 billion to, say, Central Asia or Africa. And all it requires is that a local company will form a partnership with an Indian company. Loans are provided after the assessment of the proposals and so on, and work undertakes based on that loan. So it's a seed money type of thing, seed capital that helps grow those businesses. And they're very well received in those regions. So whereas China is seen as an abrasive, predatory presence, or they will complain, for example, that Chinese engineers, but even the workers come from China. So we don't really benefit in the local economy from all that. That India is taking a different route, and it's creating better type of economic outcomes. So I think that's what India will do. It will just keep upping that game. Another thing India is doing is, instead of BRI and China building military bases in different parts of the world to counter the US, for example, what India has done is just formed partnerships with countries who will allow for logistical bases of India to operate there. So without a presence, it can just, so India is now present in about 7, 8 places around the supply chain without having to formally take over anything. So it's playing a different kind of a smarter low-key game, which is not confrontational, but it's giving India a hedge and an ability to collaborate in containing China's unilateral behavior.
Is it not true that India is better positioned in the Gulf states than China?
Definitely.
In terms of influence in technology, manpower, and overall bilateral or multilateral relations?
Absolutely, both in terms of maritime presence and its work with UAE, its work with the Gulf states, Bahrain, Qatar, and so on. India has infrastructure projects. It's a much more benign presence for those countries, and in terms of US-India strategic work in around that region. One thing I'll mention for your audience as well is to think about the significance. When China is building the BRI through India's disputed land to Gwadar in the westernmost part of Pakistan, that port, it's only 100 miles, 90 miles from Charbagh in Iran. And when China builds that highway network all the way from Xinjiang into Gwadar, it can bring, and it's actually got a contract now with Gwadar to build deep silting and place submarines there. And so its ships and subs can sail within 24 to 48 hours into the Red Sea and the Iranian waters. So it can completely bypass the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and so on, and do what the Soviets had long looked for, warm water port.
Warm water ports.
Yeah.
I understand that the U.S. Navy budgetary proposal, of the outgoing administration includes a strengthening of the U.S. naval presence in that part of the world. Is that correct? You are Washington-based. You should be quite aware of it.
This is true, and yes, both CENTCOM and PACOM are coordinating with India. The budget has gone up. The Malabar exercise going on right now, actually very close to the place we are talking about, is actually already doing live exercises, search and rescue, freedom of navigation, joint operations. And joint op means the Indian pilots are flying American equipment and vice versa. They are training together. The Japanese were a little more reluctant, but they are now participating more fully. Australia has been added after 13 years to this training. The budget is there in the Pentagon. And what's also happened is that India and US have signed 4 foundational agreements. So a lot more of geospatial real-time information and other kinds of things are possible now. So they're interoperating and planning for these contingencies, including what we just mentioned about Gwadar.
So that in a sense, the territorial conflicts in the Himalayas may be viewed as a counter to what is going on in the Gulf, in the Gulf area, and in the maritime lanes. I mean, the two are interconnected in a way.
I'll just mention this.
In terms of geostrategy.
Correct. So China is using that as a way to tell India that we are not going to stand by and let you deepen your relationships with Quad members and other kinds of things, because the whole idea of China's presence was to block and keep India locked inside a Southern or South Asia sphere and not let it pivot and move out. The other thing I mentioned is that China is very concerned about the Quad operations in Indian Ocean, because South China Sea, one way is west towards Sea of Japan, and the eastward is through these Indian waters. So if the 4 countries are blocking China's movement, then it won't be able to, sort of do things that it does, like cartographic studies or looking at the hydrographic surveys of the ocean waters, trying to create scenarios where it can quickly intervene and become one of the decisive players in this region. So China is looking at this as a larger chessboard, and keeping India pinned down south of Himalayas is a very big piece of that.
One quick question relating to the regional comprehensive economic partnership. I understand India just walked out of it, but let me broaden the question raised by a member of the audience. The long languishing European Union India proposed free trade area has not made much progress. How to understand and explain India's approach to bilateral and multilateral regional trade agreements? Mr. Faisal, perhaps.
I'll request Anupam to reply to this question, because he's dealt with himself with multi-country situations.
Certainly, sir. Certainly. So India did renegotiate its agreements or investment agreements with Southeast Asia. With Europe, there is still a continuing problem with the limits of cross subsidies by both countries in terms of farm and dairy sector. That's what, but it's not an insurmountable problem. They will solve the Europe, India, and especially now that UK is separate and wants to do a separate FTA with India. They will do that. With US also, they have become more pragmatic. So they've separated the one in trade versus the one in services and investment. And the one in services might happen faster with the US. India is becoming more pragmatic, but RCEP was done for short-term reasons. It was perhaps not the best thing to do. But the idea was that India felt that its economy will be inundated by cheap imports, especially in auto and many other places by others. And I think it's a little bit of government's protectionism. But as you see, India's tariffs have peaked. Import duties have dropped from about 30% down to 5%, in most cases to 1 or 0. So once India prepares its grounds, it should rejoin a big, trading bloc like RCEP, because it is numerous advantages to India from doing that.
These trading blocs do offer an opportunity to counter China in several areas.
Absolutely.
I think we're reaching the end of time for questions. There are a lot more questions from the audience, but I regret to say I think we're running out of time, and I'm going to return it to Penny.
Well, let me turn it over to Ani to close it up.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today from USA, from India, and other parts of the world. I want to extend my special thanks to Mr. Bajal and wish him all the best in his speedy recovery. Thank you to Anupam, and thank you to Dr. Penny Prime. Clearly, 75 minutes is not a justice to the topic which we had picked up. We all feel that, and I am happy to say that the three presenting partners, UIBS, Georgia Tech Cyber, as well as ACIR, and hopefully China Research Center, are going to collaborate and bringing a second event in this series, probably in about 4 months' time from now. So please stay tuned. Please send your suggestions, and thank you, and be safe. With this, I'm going to be signing off. All of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.